The sun beat down hard on the small southern town of Birmingham, Alabama, in the summer of 1955, as young Lila Henderson, plump and just 15, trudged home from school with her worn leather satchel bouncing against her side. Her shoes were scuffed, and the back of her dress clung uncomfortably to her skin, sweat trickling down the nape of her neck. It was one of those suffocating days where the air felt like a heavy, thick blanket, and the heat from the asphalt seemed to rise in waves, stifling every breath. The sounds of cicadas buzzed loudly in the trees, but in her chest there was only the soft, steady thrum of a heart that had known too much about the world too soon. She didn't know it yet, but that day would mark the beginning of a shift within her, a change she hadn't seen coming but that had been waiting patiently in the corners of her heart for years. Lila's family lived on the edge of town, a small house with peeling paint, just outside the borders of the white neighborhoods. She had always understood the lines, unspoken but clear, that separated her from the other children at school, from the customers at the corner store, from the lives of those whose skin was lighter than hers. She had learned that some things were not meant for her. The water fountains, the seats in the front of the bus, the smiles from the teachers who looked at her with cold disinterest, they all belonged to people who didn't look like her. On that particular day, Lila had been walking past the large white church near her school when she saw something that caused her stomach to twist. There, standing in the shade of the church's large oak tree, were two of the boys from her class, white boys, their names slipping from her memory as if they never mattered, laughing and tossing something at each other. As she walked closer, they looked her way, and their laughter stopped abruptly. "Well, look who's here," one of them said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You lost, girl." Lila's steps faltered. She wanted to keep walking, to ignore them, to pretend she didn't hear. But their eyes followed her, like two hawks watching a rabbit, and the oppressive heat seemed to close in on her. She knew it wouldn't stop with just a few words. It never did. "I said, are you lost?" the other boy repeated, louder now. His tone was sharp, a crackling insult that made her insides burn. The world around her seemed to close in, narrowing until it was just her, them, and the long, empty road ahead. She had no choice but to stop, though her legs quaked beneath her. She forced herself to raise her chin, the only defense she had against the humiliation that wanted to swallow her whole. "I'm not lost," she said, her voice thin, unsure. "I'm just walking home." The boy who had spoken first snickered, taking a step closer. "Walking home? Don't you know where you belong?" Lila's pulse raced, and she took a step back, then another. But she knew that retreat wouldn't save her. She knew the rules of this world, of their world, too well. It was when the first boy stepped forward, a hand coming out to push her roughly in the chest, that the panic began to choke her throat. She stumbled back, the scuff of her shoes against the pavement a loud, stinging reminder that she was trapped in a world she didn't belong to. The world of fear and anger. "I think it's time you learned where you belong," the second boy sneered. It was then that something deep within Lila shifted. A burning frustration rose inside her chest, a slow, seething fire that had been there, dormant, for as long as she could remember. She had always been quiet, always played by the rules, always kept her head down. But she was tired. Tired of hiding, tired of being afraid. Tired of letting them dictate what she could and could not do. Before she could stop herself, the words spilled out of her mouth, louder than she intended. "You don't know anything about where I belong." The words hung in the air, thick with defiance. The two boys stared at her for a moment, confusion flashing in their eyes. But before they could say anything more, a voice came from behind them, sharp and commanding. "That's enough." It was Mrs. Carter, the town's history teacher, and one of the only people in the whole town who treated Lila with anything resembling respect. She had always been an ally, quiet in her support but firm in her belief that the injustices around her had to be confronted somehow. Mrs. Carter was older, maybe in her late 50s, and her white hair was neatly pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, the kind of woman who carried an air of quiet authority. She stepped between Lila and the two boys, her eyes narrow with righteous anger. "You two have no business speaking to her like that. Go on, before I make sure everyone knows how you treated a young lady on her way home." The boys hesitated, then, with muttered curses, slunk off into the distance. Mrs. Carter turned to Lila, her eyes softer now, but still filled with that fierce fire that Lila had come to admire. "Are you all right?" she asked. Lila nodded, though her body still trembled. "I'll be fine," she said, though she knew she wasn't. She knew something in her had shifted, and the weight of it threatened to crush her. Mrs. Carter's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, reading the unspoken words in Lila's eyes. "Don't let them break you," she said softly, her voice low but firm. "You're stronger than they'll ever know." From that moment on, Lila's world began to change. She couldn't forget what had happened, and neither could Mrs. Carter. The older woman took her under her wing, teaching her about the civil rights movement that was slowly gaining momentum across the country. She showed her how small acts of defiance, sitting in the front of the bus, refusing to give up a seat, marching, could lead to larger change. Mrs. Carter encouraged Lila to write letters, to speak up, to find her voice in a world that didn't want her to have one. Slowly, Lila found herself gathering the courage to stand up. She began to speak at town meetings, at school assemblies, whenever she could. At first, it was only small acts, holding her head a little higher, standing a little taller. But it didn't take long for others to take notice. Her classmates, her neighbors, even some of the adults, began to see her differently. And though the fear never truly left her, something else began to grow inside her, a quiet, stubborn hope that one day things could change. And so, it was with that quiet defiance that Lila began her fight, not just for herself, but for every black person who had ever been silenced. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew deep down that she couldn't stop now. She had found her voice, and with it, she would fight until she had the freedom she deserved. And though the road ahead would be long and hard, Lila was ready. Ready to be a part of the change that had been so desperately needed for so long. The bus ride home that day had been just like every other. The same faces, the same unspoken tension that filled the air, thick with the knowledge that Lila was different from the others, she always would be. But now, she didn't mind it so much. Because this time, she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. To stand up for the world she dreamed of. And for the first time in a long time, she felt, for the very first time, the tiniest spark of hope that one day, maybe one day, the world would listen. Lila's newfound courage didn't go unnoticed. Each day after that moment with Mrs. Carter, she felt herself slowly shedding the fear that had once kept her in the shadows, and instead, she began to occupy more space, physically and emotionally. It was as if a door had opened within her, allowing the voice that had been muffled for so long to finally speak. But it wasn't easy. The town of Birmingham was a place still marred by its own legacy of deep-seated segregation, and despite the promise of change, that promise felt far away, like a distant dream that flickered just beyond reach. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, seemed like a dangerous gamble. Yet, it was the small acts, the subtle moments of defiance, that began to light a spark within Lila, a fire that burned brighter with each passing day. Her first real act of defiance happened on a Wednesday afternoon when the weather had cooled, and she found herself sitting in the waiting room of the local bus station, a place she'd visited countless times before, but always kept to herself, always hidden in the back. But this time, Lila didn't sit in the back. She took a seat in the front row, a quiet yet revolutionary act that sent a tremor of fear through her chest. The minutes seemed to stretch on, each one marked by the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. Her palms were clammy, her heart beating faster with every passing second. But she refused to move. She sat there, like she had every right to be there, like she belonged. After a while, she saw him, a tall white man, dressed in his Sunday best, with a look of surprise when he saw her sitting in the front. His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, but before he could say anything, the bus driver, a middle-aged black man, looked at Lila and then back at the man. Without a word, the bus driver said, "If she's sitting there, you'll be waiting, sir." The man scowled but ultimately moved toward the back of the bus, and for the first time, Lila felt her heart swell with a quiet pride. It wasn't much, but it was something. That moment of silent rebellion was like a signal to Lila that she wasn't alone, that there were allies everywhere, and they didn't all wear the same skin color as her. That act marked the beginning of a long journey, one that would be fraught with danger, with fear, but also with hope. After that, Lila became more emboldened, attending meetings with Mrs. Carter and the local NAACP chapter, hearing stories from older activists who had witnessed the atrocities of Jim Crow and who now dreamed of a world that had yet to materialize. She felt herself growing stronger, more resolute, her dreams of justice becoming clearer. She knew the road ahead would be long, but every small victory, every act of resistance, would take them one step closer to equality. Still, the fear remained, the constant weight of living in a world that didn't want her to succeed. It wasn't until that fateful day, on the eve of the Montgomery bus boycott, that Lila's courage would be tested again in the most profound way. The incident started small, as most things did. Lila was walking home from the library when she saw a group of young white boys standing on the street corner, laughing and joking amongst themselves. They were the same boys who had harassed her on her way home that day, and their faces had never left her mind. But this time, it wasn't a mocking remark or a shove that she feared. It was something much worse. One of the boys, a tall one with a crooked smile, caught sight of Lila walking alone. "Hey, there she is," he said to his friends, and they all turned in unison to face her. Lila felt her heart sink. She knew what was coming. This wasn't just an insult, it was a threat. "What do you think you're doing, walking like you own this place?" the boy taunted, stepping forward as the others followed his lead. "Maybe we should show you where you belong." For a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her. The memories of what had happened before, the bullying, the abuse, the terror, rushed back, and the crushing weight of those moments nearly stopped her in her tracks. But then, she remembered something Mrs. Carter had said to her just a few days earlier. "The fight for change isn't easy, Lila, but if you don't fight for yourself, who will?" Lila squared her shoulders, and, instead of retreating, she stood taller. Her voice, quiet but unwavering, cut through the tension. "You don't scare me," she said, the words slipping out more confidently than she felt. The boys laughed at first, but the laughter faltered as they realized that Lila was no longer afraid. "You think just because you're bigger than me, that you can push me around?" she continued. "I'm not your toy." One of the boys stepped forward, pushing her shoulder, but before he could say anything more, a voice rang out from across the street. "Is there a problem here?" It was Mr. Lewis, a neighbor who worked as a local businessman and was well known throughout the community. He had been an ally to many who had suffered at the hands of injustice, and Lila knew that his presence could turn the tide. The boys hesitated. They knew Mr. Lewis and his reputation for standing up for what was right. "We're just having a little fun," one of them mumbled, but it was clear they were backing off. Mr. Lewis stepped closer to Lila, a reassuring hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "I think you're all done here," he said with authority. "You might want to go home." The boys, seeing that they were outmatched, scowled but backed away, retreating down the street. Lila felt a swell of relief, but it was more than that. It was a realization. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. The small but powerful moment of resistance had made her see her own strength in a new light. Mr. Lewis gave her a knowing smile. "You did good, girl. You've got the fire in you. I can see it." As Lila watched the boys retreat, she felt something shift inside her. It was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. She realized that this was just the beginning. A spark had been ignited in her heart, and it was a fire she couldn't ignore. As the days turned into weeks, Lila's resolve only grew stronger. She attended protests, wrote letters to local newspapers, and found herself speaking out more and more. The injustice she had witnessed, the hatred she had endured, it all fueled her determination. She was no longer just a passive observer of the world. She was an active participant in changing it. And she would never go back. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and heartache, but Lila had made her choice. She would fight, even when the world seemed too broken to heal. And perhaps, just perhaps, her courage would be enough to light the way for those who came after her. The days blurred into each other, each one filled with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Lila knew that change was coming, but it was so slow, so agonizingly slow, that sometimes she doubted if it would ever truly arrive. But then, there were moments, small bursts of hope, like a glimmer of light breaking through the heavy clouds, moments when she saw the power of collective action, when she felt the weight of the community behind her. One such moment occurred at a town hall meeting. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. People from all walks of life were gathered together to discuss the next steps in their fight for equality. Lila had attended meetings like this before, but this time was different. This time, there was a fire in the air. There was an energy that hummed through the room, a sense that something bigger than all of them was beginning to take shape. It was there, amidst the faces of strangers who had become allies, that she saw the true power of solidarity. Mrs. Carter, standing at the front of the room, addressed the crowd with a passion that stirred something deep inside Lila. "We can't wait for change to come to us," Mrs. Carter said, her voice ringing out with unwavering certainty. "We have to take it. We have to demand it. Every day, every moment, we must stand firm in our conviction that we are worthy of equality, that we are worthy of dignity." Her words were like a drumbeat, steady and powerful. Lila felt herself standing a little taller, her chest puffing out with pride. For the first time, she could truly see the path ahead, the long, difficult road, yes, but a road that was clear and worth walking. As the meeting came to a close, Lila felt a sense of urgency in the air, a quiet promise that things would change, even if it took everything they had to make it happen. But the next day, that promise felt far less certain. Lila was walking home when she saw a car pull up beside her. It was a black sedan, its tinted windows making it hard to see who was inside. The car stopped, and the door opened, revealing a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and his face was as cold as stone. He stepped out of the car and looked at her, his eyes narrowing as if sizing her up. Lila froze. She had seen enough to know that the presence of men like him usually meant trouble. "You're Lila Carter, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice deep and measured. Lila nodded, the pit in her stomach growing deeper. "I've heard about you," he said, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've been stirring up trouble, haven't you?" Lila's mind raced. "I'm not stirring up trouble," she said, trying to steady her voice. "I'm just fighting for what's right." The man took a step closer, his gaze unyielding. "Fighting for what's right," he repeated, his tone mocking. "You really think you're going to change anything?" Lila swallowed hard, trying to ignore the dread that was rising within her. "I do," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The man smirked. "You should know that people like you, people who think they can just walk into places that don't belong to them, people who think they can just tear down the way things have been for generations." He trailed off, shaking his head as if he found the notion laughable. "You're wasting your time," he added with finality. "This town will never change, and neither will your people." The word stung, but Lila's eyes stayed steady. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "You don't know what I can do." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of disdain. "I think you'll learn the hard way." He turned and got back into his car, driving away without another word, leaving Lila standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that what had just happened wasn't a coincidence. This was a threat, plain and simple. But the thing was, the more they tried to intimidate her, the more determined she became. She wasn't going to be scared. She wasn't going to back down. In the weeks that followed, Lila found herself walking a dangerous line. There were more threats, more close calls, but she stood firm. She couldn't go back to the way things had been. There were too many people counting on her now, too many voices that had been silenced for far too long. Mrs. Carter's words echoed in her mind. "We have to take it. We have to demand it." And that's exactly what they did. Every day, people marched, they wrote letters, they spoke out against the injustice that had been ingrained in their lives for so long. The community was beginning to come together in ways Lila had never seen before. But it wasn't easy. Each victory, no matter how small, felt like a battle won in an ongoing war that would take years, maybe decades, to fully win. And then, in the summer of 1963, the bombshell hit. The letter came from the Birmingham jail. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words were a call to action, a reminder that the fight for justice couldn't be ignored any longer. Lila read it, her heart swelling with pride as she thought of the sacrifices that had been made before her, of the lives that had been lost, of the people who had marched and fought and bled for the dream of a better future. But then, there was something else, something that weighed heavily on her heart. It wasn't just the cause, the struggle, it was the people. People like Mrs. Carter, who had been there from the beginning, who had fought through the darkest times, and who now saw the fruit of their labor slowly starting to take shape. The death of one of her mentors, someone who had been a steady guide, shook Lila to her core, but it also solidified her resolve. There was too much at stake now. Her own heart was so deeply entwined in the struggle for justice that there was no turning back. The final turning point came when the city finally began to listen. It wasn't all at once, but it was happening. The demonstrations, the sit-ins, the bus boycotts, they had made a difference. Change was happening, and it was a victory that belonged not just to Lila, but to the entire community. The streets, once filled with hate and division, now echoed with the footsteps of those determined to make a better world. As Lila stood in the middle of those streets, surrounded by the faces of friends, family, and strangers, each of them walking together in the same direction, she couldn't help but feel that, for the first time, the weight of history wasn't on her shoulders alone. She could still hear the voice of that man from the car echoing in her mind, the man who had tried to break her spirit. She could still see the faces of the children in her community, the ones who had come after her. They would look back and remember this moment, remember her and the others who had fought for their right to be free. And maybe, just maybe, this was what change looked like. Not in one grand gesture, but in the quiet resolve of the people who dared to dream that a better world was possible. And she, Lila Carter, was going to be a part of it. Lila Carter stepped off the steps of the town hall with a resolve that shimmered in her tired eyes, as the morning mist clung to the quiet streets, the sound of determined voices still echoing in her ears from the meeting where she had spoken out against the persistent cruelty of segregation and injustice. She knew that every word she had uttered, every challenge posed to the status quo, had come at a high cost. Yet it was a price she was willing to pay for a future where dignity was not measured by the color of one's skin, but by the strength of one's spirit. And as she walked along the cracked sidewalk, memories of past humiliations and moments of quiet resistance danced together in her mind, fueling her steps and softening the edges of her grief. For each act of defiance had planted a seed of hope in the hearts of those who had long suffered in silence, and now, with the energy of the movement pulsating around her like a living heartbeat, Lila began to organize gatherings in the back rooms of community centers, and in dimly lit churches where whispers of rebellion and dreams of equality were shared like precious secrets. And in those meetings, she found allies, fellow workers, elders whose eyes held decades of wisdom, and even young souls whose courage burned bright despite the oppressive weight of tradition. And together, they crafted plans to challenge the institutions that had always sought to keep them down. Drafting letters, staging peaceful protests, and holding sit-ins at segregated facilities, all while the sound of marching footsteps and the occasional clash of voices in the streets provided a somber soundtrack to their struggle. And amidst the backdrop of a nation slowly awakening to the reality of civil rights, Lila's personal journey intertwined with a larger battle for justice, each step forward a small victory against the forces of discrimination. Yet the road was treacherous, for there were days when fear would grip her heart as she recalled the days she had been forced to sit at the back of the bus, the stares of white passengers burning into her skin like hot coals, and other times when the echoes of a cruel laugh or the harsh words of a store owner would remind her of the relentless contempt of a society built on exclusion. But even in those darkest moments, the memory of that first day she stood before the town hall, her voice trembling yet unwavering, filled her with a determination to endure, to fight not only for herself but for all those whose voices had been suppressed. And as the movement gained momentum and the protests grew larger, news began to trickle into the small town of Birmingham. A report of a peaceful sit-in at a downtown diner that had forced local authorities to reconsider their policies. A sign that change, however incremental, was stirring in the heart of the nation, and Lila, with her plump, resilient figure carrying the scars and stories of a lifetime of struggle, became a symbol of that hope. Her image captured in grainy black and white photographs that circulated in the local paper, her eyes reflecting both the pain of past injustices and the promise of a future where love and equality might prevail. And yet the battle was far from over, for every act of defiance was met with a wave of retribution, every peaceful protest with the threat of violence, and one fateful day, as Lila led a group of demonstrators to the front steps of the segregated bus station, the tension in the air was so thick that it felt as if the sky itself would crack open, and when the police arrived, their batons raised and their voices cold and unyielding, Lila stood firm, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and courage, her voice rising above the chaos as she declared that their right to be heard and seen was not negotiable. And in that charged moment, as a single white officer hesitated and then lowered his baton, a spark was ignited that sent ripples through the crowd. Yet amid the triumph of that day, a personal tragedy unfolded. News arrived that her dear mentor and friend, Mrs. Carter, had been beaten in a senseless act of cruelty simply for daring to stand up, and that revelation shook Lila to her core, filling her with grief so profound that for a long time she could barely breathe. And as she mourned the loss of the woman who had taught her to value her voice and her worth, she also discovered a hidden letter in Mrs. Carter's belongings, a confession that revealed a long-hidden alliance between white allies and black activists, a secret pact forged in the early days of the movement that had been designed to protect those who dared to challenge the oppressive system, a secret that now made Lila question everything she thought she knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true cost of fighting for change. And as that revelation settled over her like a shroud, she knew that her struggle was not just about standing up for civil rights, but about unearthing the buried truths of a past that had been manipulated to keep her people down. And with a new, burning determination, Lila vowed to honor Mrs. Carter's memory by exposing that secret alliance to the light of day, believing that the truth, once revealed, would galvanize the movement even further. And so, with every ounce of strength left in her, she began to document her journey, writing in journals and speaking in hushed tones to trusted comrades, all the while carrying the weight of her own scars and the legacy of those who had come before her. And as the years passed and the movement grew larger, Lila became both a beacon of hope and a symbol of the eternal struggle against racism, her story told and retold in passionate speeches and tear-stained letters, her plump, resilient figure a testament to the idea that even in a world determined to crush her spirit, love and truth could rise, like a phoenix from the ashes of oppression. And as she stood on the steps of a newly desegregated bus station one crisp autumn morning, with the faces of children of all colors looking up to her in wonder, she felt a bittersweet victory, a triumph tempered by loss, and the haunting memory of those who had sacrificed everything for the chance at a better tomorrow. And though the battle was far from won, and though the wounds of the past would never completely fade, Lila knew that as long as there were voices to speak out and hearts to resist, The dream of equality would continue to burn bright, a flickering flame that could one day become an unquenchable fire. And so, as the sun climbed higher in a sky once filled with darkness, Lila stepped forward into the new day, ready to write the next chapter of her story. A story of resilience, of love, of a fight that would echo through the ages, a fight that would never end, because the legacy of those who dared to dream was immortal. And every step she took was a defiant promise that no matter how deep the scars, or how high the walls built to keep her down, hope would always find a way to break through. Lila stepped into the bright light of the new day, her heart still heavy with memories of past struggles yet buoyed by the promise of a future she was determined to help create. And as she walked along the busy streets of Birmingham, she could feel the eyes of a changed city upon her, some filled with admiration and hope, others still clouded by the stubborn remnants of segregation and prejudice. But in every gaze, she saw the possibility of transformation, the slow, inevitable march of progress that would one day render the old rules obsolete. With each step, the echoes of Mrs. Carter's wisdom and the secret pact she had uncovered resonated within her, fueling her determination to document the untold stories of resistance that had been buried beneath layers of systemic oppression. And she began to record her journey in a tattered journal that became her constant companion, a testament to every protest she led, every meeting in hidden community centers, every whispered conversation with those who dared to challenge the status quo. And as the movement grew, so did her influence. Her words, once quiet and hesitant, now rang out in impassioned speeches at town halls and local gatherings, stirring the hearts of both young and old. And even as threats and intimidation from those who clung to old ways grew more frequent, Lila's resolve only hardened, for she knew that change was never easy, that every victory came at a cost, but that the cost was worth paying for a future where every person could walk freely without the burden of hate. And one evening, as the cool autumn wind swept through the streets and the sky blushed with the first hints of twilight, Lila received a call that shook her to the core. A call from a trusted friend who informed her that a crucial meeting of civil rights leaders was to take place in a nearby city, a gathering that could alter the course of their struggle, and without hesitation, she joined the meeting, where voices from across the country, both black and white, rose in unison to demand an end to injustice, to demand accountability from those who had long abused their power. And in that charged atmosphere of determination and solidarity, Lila found herself at the forefront of a new chapter, a moment when the hidden truths of the past were finally forced into the light, when the secret pact that had once been meant to protect was used as a rallying cry for reform, and as the leaders debated strategies and shared stories of loss and resilience, Lila's own narrative of forbidden love and personal sacrifice became a symbol of everything that the movement stood for, a living reminder that every act of defiance, no matter how small, was a spark that could ignite change in even the darkest of times. And as the night deepened, and the meeting adjourned with promises of renewed efforts and the forging of new alliances, Lila stepped out into the cool air with her journal clutched to her chest, her eyes shining with unshed tears and unyielding hope, knowing that the road ahead would be long and fraught with peril, that the forces of oppression would continue to lash out with bitterness and cruelty, but also knowing that the spirit of resistance was unbreakable, that the legacy of those who had fought before her now flowed through her veins, and that with every word she wrote, every protest she joined, every heart she touched, she was building a future where love and justice would triumph over hate and discrimination. And so, as the first light of dawn illuminated the horizon, Lila set off once again, her footsteps steady, her heart determined, her voice ready to be heard by a world that was finally beginning to awaken. And though the past would always be a part of her, she carried it with her as both a burden and a blessing, a reminder of the cost of freedom, and the power of love to defy even the most oppressive of systems, knowing that as long as her story lived on in the hearts of those who dared to dream of a better tomorrow, her struggle would never be in vain, and the fight for civil rights, for equality, for the right to love without fear, would continue to echo through the ages. Lila knew the fight was far from over, but as the years passed, She became a cornerstone of the movement, her name whispered in reverence among those who had once walked in fear, and though the scars of the past clung to her like shadows at dusk, she refused to be consumed by them, instead turning her pain into fuel, her sorrow into fire, and she traveled from town to town, city to city, speaking in churches, schools, community centers, anywhere that would have her, carrying with her the memories of those who had suffered in silence, their stories woven into her own, their struggles immortalized in the pages of her journal, and as she stood before crowds of hopeful yet weary faces, she reminded them that history was not just something to be remembered but something to be made, that every act of defiance, every whispered word of rebellion, every step taken in protest was another crack in the foundation of injustice, another chisel carving the future they had been denied for too long, and though threats followed her like a specter, though she found herself chased from towns, her words censored, her presence met with resistance, she pressed on, because she had seen the truth, had lived it, had felt the power of love and sacrifice, had watched her mother weep for a life stolen away, had felt the cold grip of injustice tighten around her throat, and she vowed that she would not let it happen again. Not to the next generation, not to the ones who would come after her, and the years pressed forward like a relentless tide, the marches grew larger, the voices louder, the demands stronger, and Lila, now a woman who had long shed the insecurities of her youth, who had stood on the steps of courthouses, who had looked white men in suits dead in the eye and told them their time was running out, who had been beaten and jailed and ridiculed but never broken, found herself at the precipice of something she could scarcely believe, a world that was finally listening, a world that was changing, a world where the love that had once been a secret, a whispered thing in the dark, was now shouted from the rooftops, and she watched as laws crumbled, as schools opened, as buses filled with people who sat wherever they pleased, and yet, even as the victories came, even as she stood in the crowd and listened to the great speeches that would be etched into history, she knew the work was not done, that the fight was never truly over, that racism did not die with laws but lived on in hearts and minds, in glances and whispers, in systems that refused to let go of their stranglehold, and she knew she would not live to see the day when the battle was truly won, but that did not matter, because she had done what she could, she had loved and lost and fought and bled and given everything, and that was enough, because in the end, history would remember her not as a victim, not as someone who had suffered beneath the weight of injustice, but as someone who had carried it on her back and still stood tall, someone who had taken the love she had lost and turned it into something greater, something that would live on long after she was gone. And as she sat on the porch of the small house she had built with her own hands, the journal resting in her lap, the stories of a lifetime pressed between its worn pages, she smiled, because she knew that somewhere, in a town she had once passed through, in a classroom where a teacher read from a history book that now bore her name, in the quiet of a home where a mother told her child about the woman who had once stood against the world and refused to back down, her story was still being told, her love still burning, and in that she had found her peace. Lila sat on the porch of the small house she had built with her own hands, the evening air thick with the scent of magnolias, the distant sound of children laughing mingling with the hum of cicadas, and she let her fingers glide over the worn pages of the journal in her lap, the stories of a lifetime pressed between its fragile covers, each page a testament to the battles fought, the love lost, the sacrifices made. And as she gazed out at the world she had helped shape, a world still flawed but undeniably different from the one she had been born into, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a quiet knowing that her fight had not been in vain, that the echoes of her defiance, of her resilience, would carry on long after she was gone, because she had stood when others bowed, she had spoken when silence was safer, she had walked through fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, but unbroken. And though the years had taken their toll, leaving silver in her hair and deep lines in her once smooth skin, she did not mourn the passing of time, for every wrinkle was a story, every scar a victory, and she thought of all the faces that had passed through her life, some still here, others long gone, their memories woven into the very fabric of her existence, and she thought of her mother, whose hands had held her tight on nights when the world seemed too cruel to bear, of her father, whose absence had left a void she had spent a lifetime trying to fill, of the friends she had buried, the lovers she had mourned, the moments of happiness that had felt stolen, too brief, too fleeting, but never meaningless, and she remembered the protests, the marches, the whispered meetings in back rooms where fear and hope coexisted in equal measure, the time she had been chased, spit on, called things she refused to repeat, the nights spent in jail cells where the walls felt like they were closing in. But she had never broken, never let them take her spirit, because she had known, even then, that history was not just something that happened to people, it was something they created, something they shaped with their choices, their courage, their refusal to accept the world as it was, and she had chosen to fight, to love, to believe that change was possible, and now, all these years later, she could see the proof of it in the world around her, in the young black girl who walked into the diner without a second thought, in the interracial couple that strolled down the street, hand in hand, unafraid, in the schoolyards where children of all colors played together, oblivious to the battles fought so they could do so, and she smiled, because she knew that even if the work was not finished, even if the fight was never truly over, she had done her part, she had given everything she had to give, and that was enough. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, she closed her eyes, the weight of years settling over her like a warm embrace, and she breathed in the night, the memories, the history, the love, and in that moment, she felt no fear, no regret, only a quiet certainty that she had lived as she was meant to, that she had loved fiercely, fought bravely, and left the world a little better than she had found it. And as the stars blinked to life above her, as the wind carried the distant sound of a new generation laughing, dreaming, daring to believe in a future she had once only imagined, Lila exhaled one final breath, her story complete, her legacy eternal. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey.